to wait up to 4 hours to get patients into hospital. It's terrible.
Crazy.
Rabbi, John.
Hello,
Hello,
Dennis.
Hi, Dennis.
Hello, everyone.
David,
Rabbi,
Yes.
before we start, sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt
Hi,
anybody.
David. No, go ahead.
Could you give me your WhatsApp number and your email address, please?
Sure. I'll put it onto the.
Yes, onto the group.
I'll put it onto the chat here so you can see it.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So it's 08221.
Also on that, I mean, if you're on the WhatsApp group already, you should have it because I post the reminder. So
yes, I think I've got the number, but I haven't got your email address.
there's my email address. I just put it onto the group.
Let me. Do you mind if I copy it, Rabbi?
You go ahead. It's there.
Rabbi Hecht. Oh, it's gone.
Oh, it's there.
Okay. We're on the group.
On the chat. Just open your chat. You'll see it.
Okay. All right. I'll try and get it there.
Pops up and then it goes to the side. But if you go to the bottom of your screen and you see chat, click on chat and it will come up.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we are at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to share the screen and we'll start learning. 1 moment. Good to see everyone. And as I was saying a moment ago, we want to dedicate today's learning to all those who need blessing for healing. So if you have anybody that you know in mind, you can just have them in mind, and then certainly people need our prayers, and we should be certain about the power of our prayer and the power of learning, the power of our mitzvahs to bring extra blessings. So indeed, we should be able to share good news. Okay, there we go. Sharing the screen. Let me go to the top here. Okay, so we continue with these laws of Erechin, which is, as you all know by now, it's a particular type of commitment that one makes to ultimately give a gift to the upkeep of the temple. And the way you do that is by committing the value or the erech, not actually more precisely, not the value, but the erech. And actually we'll highlight that in today's chapter, that this whole idea of the erech is really not specific to any market value per se or any type of valuation of an individual, but it is strictly a biblical term that is translated as the Torah expresses it, which we've said before, that it's an amount that is determined by age and gender and nothing else. Okay, so it's a unique expression that the Torah has conferred, to which the Torah confers a certain value. If you make that pledge, that ought to be then paid. So we're going to deal with today what really happens if somebody doesn't have the money that they've committed to pay. And there's going to be two stages that we look at. There's the moment that a person actually makes his pledge, and then there's the moment that the Beis Din actually determines the value of the individual. So what happens if a person's financial situation changes from when he made the commitment to when it's actually evaluated in the court? Okay, so these are the type of questions the Rambam deals with in this chapter. So, chapter 3, the first halakha: when a person pledges the erech of someone less than 20 years old, which has a certain value, right? And he does not stand before a court for appraisal until he exceeds that age. So in other words, the individual who I have committed their worth was less than 20. And now by the time I stand before the court for the appraisal, he's now older than 20. So the donor is required to give only the erech of one less than 20. For the erech is defined only at the time that it is pledged and not at the time one stands before the court. So you only become obligated to make the payment once you do stand before the court, as we learned previously, but the amount that you're liable is only the amount at the time that the pledge was made. Okay, all of the arachim that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah are to be given when the one who makes the pledge is wealthy. In other words, we gave amounts beginning with 3 shekel all the way up to 50 shekel. When is one determined to make that full payment? If he can afford it. Over here, that's what, if a person is wealthy, means that if they have the full means to make the full payment. If, however, he was poor and he does not have the means, so let's say I give the pledge of what's the highest amount as a male between the ages of 20 and 60. What happens if I can't afford 50 shekel? So what he's saying, what we're saying over here, if he was poor and he does not have the means, he's required to give everything that he possesses, even if it's only a seller or a shekel. And he discharges obligation, as the pasuk says, if he is too poor to pay his erech, then the priest should evaluate him according to his capacity. In other words, what we're saying over here is there's two things that need to be evaluated. There's the value of the individual that you're saying I'm giving their erech, and there's what I can afford. So basically, if I commit to giving the erech of so-and-so who's 30 years old, I have to give ideally 50. But what if I only have 10 in my bank account? 10 shekel. Then that's all I have to give. What if I only have 1 shekel in my bank account? Then I only give 1 shekel. What if I don't even have 1 shekel? So we'll learn about that in a moment. But in the meantime, you've got to give, if all you can afford is a shekel, you give a shekel, and you have then fulfilled your duty. Okay, let's just see a further point before we go back to the question, what happens if I don't have a shekel? Which source teaches that if he possesses only 1 seller, it is sufficient to give that seller? By the way, the Rambam over here is using the term seller, which means 1 coin is interchangeable with what we use as shekel in the term of the Torah. So it is sufficient to give that seller. How do you know if you only have 1? That's good enough. And thereby you fulfill your commitment. Because the pasuk says, all of Yarechim will be in holy shekalim. Now, in essence, in the psukim that define the obligation of making these payments, this is an extraneous verse. It's unnecessary because we've already said you pay 3 shekel, you pay 10 shekel, you pay 50 shekel, right? Or 20 shekel, whatever the different amounts are. So what does this come to teach us? That there is no erech less than a seller and not more than 50. That means if I pledge an erech of a person that's 30 years old, I've got to give up to 50. So even if I'm extraordinarily wealthy, I only have to give 50. But if I'm poor and I don't have 50, if I only have 30, I give 30. If I've got 10, I give 10. And if I only have 1, I give 1. Now, halacha 4, the question that we asked, if a person does not possess even a seller, we do not take less than a seller from him. You can't make a payment of less than a shekel. Instead, the entire amount is considered as a debt incumbent upon him. So if you make the pledge, you can't afford anything, not even 1 shekel, so you remain indebted. If he acquires property and becomes wealthy, he must pay a full erech as prescribed by the Torah. So it's an interesting point of here. See, if you kind of poor, you only have 1 shekel, you pay the shekel and you've fulfilled your duty, because actually what we've just learned now is that from extracting from the psukim, even though I make a commitment, which in the example we gave theoretically is up to 50, but I can't afford that. I only have to give what I afford. But if you can't even afford 1 shekel, right? And if I give what I can afford, I've fulfilled my obligation. But if I can't even afford 1 shekel, well, then I remain indebted. And when that money comes to me, then I'm going to pay it. Halacha 5. When a rich person pledges an erech and then becomes poor. So that's the question I intimated in the introduction. Or when a poor, meaning he becomes poor at the time that the Beis Din is now actually making his evaluation. Or when a poor person pledges an erech and he becomes wealthy before he was evaluated. So he must give a full erech. If ever he pledged an erech when he was poor, became wealthy, and then became poor again before he was evaluated, he may give the erech required of a poor man. But if he was wealthy when he made the pledge, so he could afford it, or when he comes before the court and he can afford it, then he must pay the full amount, or he remains indebted to that amount. The only exception would be if he was poor, then became rich, and then became poor before he stood before the court. Then he would only have to make what he could afford, basically, as a poor person. When a rich man says, I pledge my erech, or I pledge the erech of so-and-so, and a poor person heard and says, I pledge whatever he said, the poor person is obligated to pay the erech required of a wealthy man, meaning the full erech. See, here we come to that point that I mentioned earlier. This phrase that I say, erech ploni alai, or erech ki alai, the word erech is a unique word that the Torah over here translates as a specific value based on a person's gender or age. right? And therefore, I only have to pay what the Torah expects of me. If I can afford the full amount that the Torah has attributed to that age and gender, I pay it. If I can't, I pay less. It's not really got to do with if I'm poor or wealthy. As much as it has to do is what's the commitment at the time that I say it. So he has an interesting scenario, right? A wealthy person says, Erki Olai, my value, I'm pledging. And if this person is 30 years old, what's their value? 50 shekel. Now, a poor person overhears him saying this. And what does the poor person say? The poor person doesn't say, his erech is on me. He says, whatever he's committed to, I'm committing to. And because for the wealthy man, the word erech at that moment, in that context, means 50 shekel, the poor person is going to owe 50 shekel. We'll see soon what happens if he doesn't have the liquidity to pay it. What do you do then? But the point is, he's obligated 50 shekel. Unlike in the previous halachot, which he said erech alai, if he would have said it and he could only afford 10, well, he would only be obligated 10. Here he's obligated, in our example, 50. If I have a person pledges the erech of a wealthy man, saying I pledge his erech, he is liable only for a poor man's erech, meaning what he is capable of paying. So again, the Rambam is clarifying, it's not just because the guy that I'm referring to is wealthy doesn't make me liable if I use the phrase erech, right? Because the phrase erech is what's really the subject over here. So if I'm poor and I say erech, even though the person that I'm referring to is a wealthy man, I don't have to pay 50 because he can afford 50. I pay what I can afford. And that's what the Torah obligates me at that time. Halacha 7. What is the difference between a person who is liable for a poor man's erech and one who is liable for the erech of a wealthy person, which is the entire sum mentioned in Torah? Once everything that he owns is expropriated from a poor man, even if it is only one seller, and then he becomes wealthy, he's not liable to pay a greater sum. Okay, this is emphasizing the point we made earlier. Because he's paid his due once he paid the one seller if he was poor when he made his commitment. If ever he would have been liable for the erech of a wealthy man, the entire erech would remain a debt for which he is liable until he becomes wealthy and pays it. Right? So he remains indebted, even if he can't afford it at the time. Halacha 8. When a person explicitly mentions the sum of the erech. So now this is interesting, right? If we use the phrase erech alai, so then we default to what the Torah's meaning is, and it could be anywhere between what you can afford and the highest amount of 50. But if he says, I pledge my erech of 50 salayim, so it's a person who's in the age bracket between 20 and 60, and he says, I pledge my erech of 50 salayim, he specifies 50 salayim, or I pledge the erech of so-and-so of 50 salayim, in that instance, obviously it would be a female, because that amount would find by a female, then his financial obligation is not evaluated in the court. Instead, we expropriate everything that he possesses, and the remainder remains a debt for which he is liable until he becomes wealthy and pays. In other words, the point that he's emphasizing is that if you specify an amount, even if you use the phrase erech, you're liable for the amount. And if you're poor and you can't afford that amount right now, well, we'll expropriate stuff from you to make up that amount. And if even that doesn't bring you to the total, you'll remain indebted to the temple coffers. Halacha 9. Similarly, if one says, I pledge my worth, or I pledge the worth of so-and-so, we do not evaluate his possessions. The rationale is that a pledge of worth is like an explicit vow, right? This we said previously. When you say damai, worth, as opposed to erech, which is that biblical phrase, it's going to go on the amount that person will be evaluated at in the marketplace. It is like someone who says, I pledge a manna to the temple treasury, he's obligated to give an entire money. The point is that even if you can't afford it at the time, you remain indebted. That's the point of halacha. Unlike when I said erech, that I only pay what I can afford at the time. Okay. Halacha 10. When a person says, I pledge an erech, without explaining his words, he's not considered as having pledged 3 shekalim. Instead, he is judged according to his financial capacity, as is law regarding to other erechim. Remember, we learned previously that if somebody just says, Harei alai erech, I'm taking upon myself a commitment of an evaluation, and he doesn't specify a person, right? If he specifies a toddler, then you know it's 3 shekalim. If he specifies a grown man, it's 50 shekalim. So, but that's what he's saying over here. We don't default to the lowest erech if the person can only afford 1 shekel. It's not like he explicitly said 3 shekalim. You following? Because we learned 2 things. We said if I say Harei erech alai, a person said, and I refer to a person who's between 20 and 50. I owe theoretically up to 50, but if I can only afford 1, I only pay 1. What if I just say erech? I'm committing a pledge of someone's value, and I don't specify who it is. Now, usually we say we default to the lowest amount. That's what we learned in the previous halachot. You default to the lowest amount, which is 3 shkalim. So what the Rambam is clarifying over here is that would not be the same if you can't afford even 3 shkalim. It's not as if you said, although we said previously it defaults to 3, it's not considered as if you. So if you can't afford 3, you only pay what you can pay. I hope that's clear. Halacha 11. Following, and here it gets a little bit technical. I'll try to explain it as we read through the halacha. The following law applies when a person states, I pledge my erech, and then repeats, I pledge my erech. Basically, let's say the guy's between the age of, that he owes 50 shkalim. Now we know that you can pledge your value more than once. So he now owes 100 shkalim, right? But so he's now made 2 separate commitments, one on Monday and the next one on Thursday. So what happens if this person is poor and he only has 10 slaim to his name? So technically he owes 100, one for Monday's commitment, 50 for Monday's commitment, and 50 for Thursday's commitment. But he only has 10 seller in his bank account. Now, so what happens? So now he goes to the court and they evaluate Thursday's commitment. They evaluate Thursday's commitment, okay, which was the second commitment. And he gives 9 for the second arech, because that's what he can afford, right? He doesn't give 50 because he can't afford 50. What does he give? He has 10, but he gives only 9. Then he fulfills his obligation of both of them. What does that mean? For the erech, that means to say that now, if he had his second commitment evaluated first, he can pay 9. And then when he gets his first commitment evaluated, he pays 1, because remember, 1 is the minimum that you would pay. Basically, the point that the Rambam is making over here, as he goes on, he says, for erech are not like debts. What happens when a person is in debt? In other words, if I borrow money from John, so now there's a lien on my property, and then I borrow money from David. So he also has a lien on my property. Let's say David came and took from my property first. But who has a lien on my property before David? John does. So if John goes to the court, even though I still owe David money and I owe John money, the court will take the whatever the property is away from David and give it to John, because the lien was on you first. So if that were the case when it came to these commitments, it would seem that if I'm paying my second commitment first, I'm paying for money that I don't have. So that's what he's saying. It doesn't work like debts. Why? Because although everything it possesses are on lien to the first arech, once the temple sanctuary is collected, it's due, it has been collected. In other words, over here, when I make a commitment to the temple, it's the same, I'm owing it to the same place. So once the commitment was made, or once the payment was made for my second commitment, it's not like I'm taking away from the first commitment, as in the case of a debt would be. And therefore, I still now have 1 shekel left to pay up on my first commitment, and I'm clean. He says, if however, the person, he gave 9 slaim, let's say I made a pledge on Monday and on Thursday, then I went to the court whenever, and they evaluated Monday's commitment first. So what did I do? I thought I'd be clever. I thought I'll pay 9 slaim for the evaluated first commitment, and that way I keep 1 seller in my bank account, so that I can pay up 1 seller for my second commitment, because I know that if I don't even have 1 seller, then I'm going to be expected to pay the full 50, right? It's going to be a debt that I'm going to be liable for. So I thought I was going to be clever. I paid only 9 for my first commitment, and I kept 1 thinking I'll pay it for my second commitment. No, the halacha is not like that. You can't do that. So if ever he gave 9 slaim for the first arech and 1 for the second, he fulfilled his responsibility for the second arech, but not for the first. The rationale is that everything that he possesses, because what happened was when he paid 9 for the first one, he really should have paid everything he had, because technically he should have paid up to 50 in the example that we gave. And because he only paid 9 and not everything that he could have afforded, he hasn't fulfilled his responsibility there. So for the second one, all he had taka was one shekel left. He paid that. That's fine. But everything that he possesses is on lien to the first arech. And when he gave 9, he retained the seller. Thus, he did not give everything in his possession. And therefore, the remainder of the first arech should remain a debt incumbent upon him until he becomes wealthy and pays it off. In other words, if you don't pay what you could have paid, you remain indebted for the full amount. And that's what happens in that instance. So it's an unusual instance. We made 2 pledges. You couldn't afford both. If you pay the second one first and keep a small amount, then you could pay the first one. But if you pay the first one first and try to keep a little bit extra for the second one, that's no good. Because your obligation was to pay everything that you had. Okay? Interesting scenario. Halacha 12. When a person says, I pledged 2 of my arechim. So now it's not like one after the other, but it was 2 at the same time. So he owes 100, because if it's in the example that we gave, right, where he's worth 50, or where not where he's worth 50, he has to pay 50 according to the valuations of the Torah. He says, 2 of my arechim on me. So he now owes 100. And he possesses only less than that sum. So only has, let's say he only has 50 or only has 30. Okay, we'll say 50 because it keeps it easy. So now he says there's an unresolved question. We don't actually know what happens if he only pays part of it. So what happens? So what's the question? Is the money he possesses on lien to them both because they come into effect at the same time? And hence he should give half of what he possesses for one arech and the other half for the other one. And that way he pays what he can afford for each and it'll be sorted out. Right? Or is he required to give one full arech or everything that he possesses for one arech, and the other should remain a debt incumbent upon him, which he will pay, either as a wealthy man or as a poor man according to his financial capacity. Right? In other words, if he owes them both equally at the same time, and there's a lien on both of them at the same time, then let's say he had 50, he should pay 25 for his one commitment, 25 for his other commitment, and he's paid everything he can afford. Or do we say, no, he has, because he has 50, he has to pay one full amount, and then he has nothing left for the other one, he remains indebted for the other one. So he says that remains a question. In practice, what we do is that, yes, he'll remain indebted, and when he can afford it, he can pay it. If he passes away, though, such an obligation would not extend to his family because it's a doubt, because he's paying off a debt in doubt, as we've learned previously. Halacha 13, when a person sets aside his arech or his worth, he either said, I pledge erki alai, or he says damav alai. And then he takes money and he puts it aside, but he has not yet deposited it in the Beit HaMikdash, right? And now that money that he set aside got lost or stolen. So the question is, is that money now no longer his? Because he's already set it aside. So this is what the Rambam says. He is liable to replace them, even if he did not accept responsibility for them until they reach the temple treasurer, as implied by the pasuk. You will give your arech on that day, sanctified unto God. Even though you set them aside, they're nevertheless considered as ordinary property until they reach the temple treasure. Okay, so you can't say I set it aside and therefore it's sanctified and it's no longer mine, because technically, actually, he could still use that money as his own. It's not sanctified until he actually deposits it at the Beit HaMikdash. 14. Temple treasurers are entitled to seize collateral of arachim or pledges of worth. So here we go. What happens if the guy doesn't have liquid cash and he can't pay? He says, listen, I made a commitment of so-and-so's worth or so-and-so's erech, but I don't have 50 shekel. I don't even have 30 shekel. So they're allowed to go and seize property. They will take what they vowed from the donor against his will, meaning they'll take whatever they need to sell and get the worth that he owes. They're not required to return the collateral by day or by night. So it's interesting over here. So they hold on to collateral until he pays it back, right? Now he has 2 interesting points he's saying over here. When we learn the laws of borrowing and lending, so the Torah is careful there to say that one is never allowed to forcibly take collateral for an individual for a private loan. Over here he says, when you owe a pledge to the Beit HaMikdash, it can be forcibly taken from you. Another thing is that when you take collateral from somebody and they need that item, you have to return it to them for use when they use it. Not the case when the temple takes collateral from somebody. And then ultimately what they'll do is they'll sell all the land and property and move property in their possession, including their clothing, household articles, servants, and livestock, taking their payment from everything. They can sell anything in order to make up to make their money. They may not ever sell the clothing of the donor's wife, that of his son's clothing, and that he had clothing that he had dyed for them, nor new sandals that he purchased for them. Basically, you cannot take clothing and stuff from members of his family, which are theirs, and therefore are not held in lien, so to speak, on his pledge. Similarly, when a person consecrates all of his property, he has not consecrated these articles. If a person says, all my property is hektish, it does not include the property, the personal items of his family members. Okay, halacha 50. When a person pledges arechem, the worth of an entity, or he consecrates a money to the temple treasury and does not possess the immediate resources to meet this pledge. So again, over here, would expropriate all the movable property he owns, leave him only his head tefillin, arm tefillin, his sandals, a chair to sit on, and a bed and a mattress to appropriate for him to sleep on. So his basics for his spiritual and physical requirements you leave, but otherwise you take what is ever he has in order to pay that commitment. And we give him food for 30 days and clothing for 12 months for himself alone. We do not make these provisions for his wife and children, although he's obligated to provide for their livelihood in their clothing. So just as we won't take their stuff, we're also not obligated to give them or leave them, to give him resources to maintain his obligation toward them. We leave him only garments that are fitting for his social standing. That means like this: if they happen to take away from him garments that are of great value, they can sell that and provide him with with a more basic wardrobe that is fitting of his stature. And here, obviously, we're talking about somebody who can't afford to pay, so he's relatively poor. He as we see in the next halacha, right? If he possesses silk garments and golden garments, we remove them from him and give him garments that are appropriate for a person of his social standing for the weekdays, but not for Shabbos and festivals. In other words, you've got to give him stuff that is you would sell the more elaborate clothing and give him cheaper clothing toward. That's all that you have to leave them with. Now, if he was a craftsman, we leave him 2 of every type of the tools of his trade. So in other words, you don't want to take away a person's possibility of making a livelihood. What is implied? If he was a carpenter, we leave him with 2 planes and 2 saws. If he had many tools of one type and a few of another type, we do not sell the many of those of which he possesses a lot and purchase some of those which he possesses a little. Instead, we leave him 2 tools. It's the same rule. Always 2 tools of those which he possesses a lot, and the ones that he only has one of, you leave him the one that he has one of. 18. If he was, now what we're going to differentiate over here is those are tools that he actually needs to do his work. But if he was a donkey driver or a farmer, we don't leave him his livestock, even though he can only earn his livelihood with it. And if he was a sailor, we do not leave him his boat. Instead, everything must be sold. So interesting. Only those things which he actually uses in his hands as tools we leave, but not these extra type of things, even if his livelihood is dependent on it. Halacha 19, if there were livestock, servants, and pearls among his possession, the merchant said, and merchants said, so here's the story. Basically, so now you've taken from him certain items that you're allowed to take. And you got a businessman comes along, the appraiser says like this: if clothing worth 30 zuz is purchased for the servant, his value will increase by 100 zuz. Right? So the guy who's the temple money, you come and you take away one of his slaves. And the appraisers say, you know what, this guy, he's looking shabby. So if you put him on the market now, you'll only get 50 zuz for him. But if you dress him in clothes that's worth 30 zuz, you'll get 100. In other words, your profit will be an extra 20, let's say. That one comes. Or if we wait to sell the cow to a meat market, its price will increase by 10 zuz rather than selling it now. Or if this pearl is taken to this and this place, it's the big city, it will be worth much more money. But here it will only be worth a small amount. In other words, they're saying, go and try to find ways of selling these items for more than what you can get it over here. The halacha is we do not heed them. Instead, what is done, we sell everything in its place and at its time. And as the Bab proof text implies, as the pasuk says, you will give your arech on that day, sanctified to Hashem. This teaches us every entity that is consecrated to the temple treasury is not embellished. You don't wait to try to see if it gets greater value. Nor do we wait to take it to the market, nor do we bring it from place to place. Instead, consecrated articles are sold only in their place and at their time. It seems that the concern of here is that all of these things are projected possibilities, but are not guaranteed. So the point is that the temple must sell it at the given price at the time. It's not allowed to take on risk, basically. It's not a business. Somebody made a commitment. You sell it for what you get now, and we don't take on any level of risk. Halacha 20, the final halacha in this chapter. When does the Bava apply with regard to movable property and to servants? Okay, that you have to sell it immediately when you have it. But when it comes to land, by contrast, we announce the sale for 60 consecutive days, morning and evening. As you can have a show house, so to speak, or a show field for 60 days. And then afterwards they're sold, meaning it's sold to the highest bidder. Okay, so there we go. That's